I'd be a liar if I said this miniature only took me a couple of minutes, but it will only take me a couple of minutes to show you how you can paint it yourself.
Hello there, and a warm welcome to another tea tutorial, the video series in which you will find your inner self of miniature painting. And while the tea leaves are dispersing their pleasant aromas in a cup of hot water, and the sand of time is trickling down grain by grain, I am spreading colors on the miniature in minutes.
So I've got this Christmas elf. It's an STL Ollie found over at my mini factory. I put the link in the video description if you want to check it out. But for the diorama we're creating in collaboration with Chicken's Tabletop Crafting, none of the available poses really fit. So I imported the STL into Cinema 4D, sliced it into 6 parts and sent it over to Ollie for printing. Bit of green stuff and super glue later, and I converted him into this running pose to put some black primer on. Now I'm gonna paint his jacket green. For this I use Scale Artist Sap Green and Scale Color Black Leather. I get this dark, a bit dirty looking mix that is perfect as a color for my darkest shadows. I now use this mix to paint the whole jacket. 2 layers are good enough for this step, even if there's still some primer showing, especially in the shadow areas, as this provides even more contrast, which generally is always a good thing for miniatures. Next I use sap green to sketch in areas I want to be lighter. This can be super rough, we'll deal with making it prettier later. Right now I just want to make sure the placement of lighter areas fits. I feel like the Scale Artist colors take a bit longer to dry, which in this case is a good thing. This way I can use Scale Artist Spring Green and a bit of wet blending to further sketch the lighter areas. And like I said, nothing needs to be perfect at this point. In our diorama the elf is running away from the red gobbo, which means his upper body is angled forward a bit and he's moving towards the edge of the diorama. This is why I want the light to come from behind the elf. This means the majority of lighter areas are on his back, his shoulders and the back of his arms. Still using Spring Green, I start to get a bit more into detail by painting in a cross-hatching scheme, mostly focusing on the edges of the previously sketched in areas. I do this over multiple layers, at the same time I add more water to the color to slowly make it less opaque. This way I start to create a gradient and also add some cloth texture. For the first layer of highlights I use Vallejo Ice Yellow mixed with Spring Green and a teeny tiny bit of Pure Yellow. In this case I use Chimera's Cold Yellow, but to be honest any different brand yellow will do the trick as well, for example Vallejo Game Colors Moon Yellow. In the same way as before I sketch my highlights. This time I switch between cross-hatching and stippling to make the texture a bit more interesting. Wherever possible I try to paint individual lines in one layer parallel to each other, and for the following layer go over in a 90-degree angle. This way I get a texture that's similar to woven cloth. Now I water down Spring Green to achieve a glaze consistency and then do a couple of glazes to make my gradient smoother and blend the different colors together. It's important to note that you gotta be patient, wait for the glazes to really dry before applying the next one. Otherwise chances are you'll remove cover from the previous layer and you'll get this like coffee stain effect, which we usually don't want. Now I redefine the shadows. For this I alternate between dark and light mixes. I keep the consistency very watery. This process might take a couple of layers and patience, as I said before, but it really does the trick to blend everything together further. For the cloth texture I use the folds of the cloth as a guideline. And just as before, I start with the darkest color and work my way up. For the shadows, I use Scale Artist Burgundy Wine Red. Over the black primer, this color looks rather brown, but that's not a bad thing. And don't worry about a bit of primer shining through, as there will be a lot more layers of more vibrant colors following the base coat. Short side note, I love the Scale Artist colors, but they are not the right fit for any situation where you want to achieve an opaque base coat after only a couple of layers. They're very well suited for wet blending and glazes and artsy techniques, but if you want to have results quickly in a base color wash highlight fashion, they probably aren't the right fit for you. But back to topic and to the next color, Vallejo's Scarlet Blood. It's a very vibrant red that I use for the brightest part of the red. I sketch in where I want the highlights to sit and then alternate between Burgundy Wine Red and Scarlet Blood to achieve gradients. Just as before, I use cross-hatching for texture. Because the previous layers were very dark, it takes some time before Scarlet Blood reaches its full saturation. This means I'm doing a lot of layers until I like the result. To achieve even smoother gradients between dark and light areas, I water the red down again. But I don't really work the gradients into perfection by any means, because I actually do like this rougher look of the miniature. After finishing the red parts of the miniature, I add another couple of glazes over the green parts, because after seeing both red and green painted in, I wasn't quite happy yet. This again took a bit of time and lots of patience, because a single glaze of course doesn't cover well, but many glazes do. This also means the highest highlights are now a bit too dark. This is why I use the highlight mix again to brighten everything up. The process of glazes and then redo highlights can be repeated as often as you'd like. For the white fur parts, I use scale color graphite gray. In comparison to the scale artist paints, this one is rather opaque, so for the most part one layer did the trick to achieve good base coverage. For midtone, I mix graphite gray with white from Vallejo and do lots of tiny dots. For this step I want to make sure that the dots look natural. So refrain of doing like these lines of dots and concentrate on placing them randomly. For the parts where I want the highlights to be, I do another layer of dots. After that I use pure white, a thing I usually tell people not to do, but it's actually fine in this case. And again paint dots where the highlights are supposed to sit. Next I water down graphite gray and paint over everything. For glazes with a darker color, I always try to start the brush strokes in the part that is brighter and finish in darker areas. I do it this way because in the area where the brush leaves the miniature, more pigment remains. This results in a smoother blend. I repeat this process with the midtone gray, and finally I use white again, put a couple of dots in the brighter areas and do a small edge highlight because that's what we do, and with that the fur is finished. For the skin, I again use burgundy wine red as a base coat. In theory, there are colors that are better suited for this type of skin, but I usually like to reuse colors I already used on my miniature. This way I don't have to think about whether the colors will work together, because by reusing already existing colors, I keep a general coherency. For the midtone, I mix burgundy wine red, ice yellow and yellow. I get a very red skin tone, which I use to sketch highlights on the cheek, the forehead, the nose and the chin. This again takes a couple of layers to get good coverage. And again, I water the paint down more the more layers I do. Everything for the gradients. At this point the skin is super red. To complement that, I add more ice yellow and yellow to the previous mix. The resulting highlight color is far less red. I use this now to add more highlights and shape the face. Fun fact, I just completely ignore the previously established light source because otherwise the face would have been super dark, which would have looked a bit weird. I used glazes over the whole face to take away some of the red and blend the colors together. Afterwards, for the brightest highlights, I use pure ice yellow in a few spots to achieve higher contrast. Next, I use a glaze of magenta by Chimera to get a pink sheen back into his cheek. Next, I do some detail work, the eyes, and put some work into the shadows on his neck. For his shoes, I again start with a couple base coats of burgundy wine red. Next I add a bit of yellow into the burgundy and use that mixture to sketch in highlight areas. To get a used look of the leather, I do some cross hatching again, but in a more irregular pattern to get the shoes to look more worn out. Next I paint a couple of thin layers with a mix of burgundy and black leather to make the color look more lively. But I'm not really satisfied with the colors as of yet, so I add scale color Mars orange to the midtone and do some more work on the brighter areas until I'm satisfied with the placement. Next up are a couple of edge highlights, followed by smoothing out the gradients with a couple glazes of black leather and burgundy wine red. Now I add a couple of scratches and imperfections, and we're done. Okay, no. I painted the rest of the leather, the belt, the hair and the hands, but there's nothing new to tell you for these parts, so I'm just not gonna. If you wanna know what or who or elf is running away from, you should check out this video by Chicken's Tabletop Crafting. He's showing off his insane basing skills and how he combined my Christmas elf and Sven's red gobbo into an awesome diorama. Thank you for watching, hope you have great holidays, and I'm gonna drink my tea now.